My name's Eric Johnson. I'm Skyline's designated broker. I kind of oversee all of the rules and compliance and Department of Licensing stuff and all of that for all of our branches. And then each of our branches has a branch manager too. And you've probably met or talked to your individual branch manager at some point. Um, Today's class, the goal is for you to walk away having a really good idea of what the language on the purchase and sale agreement entails. We're going to go fairly in depth on some of the um, elements of the PSA. It's 6 pages long, as most of you probably know. Some of you have read all of the language. Some of you have never actually even looked at it, which is kind of okay, but I'd like you to get to know it better. Ultimately, it's up to your client to read and ask questions about the language. I would like you to be in a position where you have a good idea when they do ask you those questions. Um, we're going to also touch on a couple of the other forms, time permitting. Our primary form today is going to be Form 21. That's the residential purchase and sale agreement. There are other PSAs, and that includes like condominium PSA is Form 28, and we've got a manufactured home on leased land PSA. We've got a vacant land PSA, multifamily, and then there's commercial. So there's a handful of different PSAs. You're going to want to know which one is going to be the appropriate one for you. The form we're doing today, Form 21, is the most common form you're going to use. That's why we've chosen it for this class. The language within it is consistent with the language in the other forms. Only difference is on the other forms, you might have some minor variations uh, on themes depending on how it works. Like a condominium will have a resale certificate clause because that's something that you'll see on a condominium. A vacant land will have a feasibility clause. Multifamily is going to have something about books and leases and things like that because they're probably rentals. So there will be little variations, but the bulk of the language is going to be what we're going to cover today. Let's see. For Department of Licensing purposes, if you want to get clock hours, you've got to have your camera on and be able to prove to me occasionally during the class that you're engaged with the class. The way we'll do that is I'll ask you a question, have you type something in the chat window. I won't abuse you on that. I won't make you do it too often, but the DOL requires that I have proof that you are actually at the class and engaged. That's the reason we have to have your camera on and have you be able to answer a couple questions. If you don't need the clock hours and if you're only here just to get the information, that's okay too. Then you can have your camera off. We won't give you a certificate after it's all done. Speaking of the certificates, it usually takes about a week for my admin to get those kicked out to you. So once we finish class today, we'll determine who actually earned the certificates, and then I'll turn that over to her, and she'll print them and send them out to you. Let's see what else. We're going to take a break about halfway through the class, and it'll be probably a 10 to 15-minute break. This class, we tend to use every bit of the 3 hours. For DOL purposes, 3 hours is actually 50-minute hours. So we'll very likely go over that. So we're scheduled to end at 2 o'clock. I'm going to do my best to wrap up by 2 o'clock so you guys can carry on with your day, whether it be doing real estate or just getting out there and enjoying this gorgeous weather. So um, with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flip my screen and share with you what the stuff that I want to be showing you. Bear with me a second while I do that. Okay, there we go. Now, can you guys see a Northwest MLS listing in Gig Harbor? Awesome, thank you. Um, okay, so this is just a home I randomly, I just did a search for $1 million homes anywhere in the state just to see what would come up. I got really depressed when I looked at what you could get for $1 million in Seattle and Bellevue and such. So I decided to skip down into Pierce County. So not that it really matters, but this is just one I kind of chose randomly that way. Um, when you open up a listing, there's things you're going to want to look for. And when you're working with your client, of course, you're going to want to know about the price and the days on market and all the marketing remarks and things like that. But when it gets down to writing an offer, it really comes up. You're going to want to get some information out of the listing itself. In this case, they've requested next title, and they've also requested escrow at next title, and a closer by the name of Jennifer Jones. So it's good information to have. Um, so that's all we really need out of the broker remarks. Sometimes there's other information there that's handy, but that's it for this one. Next thing I want to do is start looking down around through the listing itself to find some information that we're going to use in our offer. Now, ideally, you've already toured this home with your client and you um, you know what's going on with the house, you know what's there. But that brings us down to the appliances section. There's going to be a place where we have to ask for these appliances, even though they've been included in the listing. Okay, so in this case, they're including a dishwasher. Notice there's an S. You will see some really fabulous houses out there that have multiple kitchens. They may have multiple dishwashers. That S in parentheses implies that the seller is including all of them. So if there are more than one, they would be included in the listing. You still have to ask for them, or else you're not guaranteed you're going to get them. Okay, now moving oh, the other thing that we want to look at is going to be the amount of commission that's offered on this one. They are offering 2%. We're going to talk about this going forward. You can ask for more than that, but you have to have a buyer brokerage services agreement, in other words, a Form 41, saying that your buyer is willing to give you a percentage or a flat fee or whatever it might be. Most often it's going to be a percentage. 72% of all listings have 2.5%. Therefore, if you ask your buyer to give you 2.5%, there's a good chance you're going to match up. In this case, if you ask for 2.5%, there's going to be an extra 0.5% that you're going to need to discuss with your buyer because the seller is offering this amount. And you can negotiate for the 2.5% from the seller, but this is what they are upfront offering. For those of you who have been around a while, you know back in the good old days, you weren't allowed to negotiate your commission, but that law changed considerably now that the law changed back in 2024 to where the buyer broker must be paid by the buyer. That's the basics of the law. You must have a contract with that buyer in order to receive payment. Actually, any real estate agent, in order to receive payment from anyone, must have a contract with that party. So there's that. But we've got the way they worked around that so that the seller could still pay commission is that your buyer is in a contract with the seller, and your buyer can ask the seller to give them a credit for the amount that they've agreed to pay you. So we've got two different contracts. One is a contract between you and the buyer, and that's for a certain amount, probably 2.5%. And then we've got another contract between the buyer and the seller where the buyer is saying, hey, seller, please give me a credit for that 2.5% so that I can pay my broker and not have to go out of my pocket. Okay, now moving forward into other things we want to look at. Um, there's a lot of information down here as far as the utilities and such. In this one, the big one I want to look for is the sewer. In this case, it's on septic. Gig Harbor's in Pierce County, so there's going to be a very specific septic form that we would choose. Um, the other thing I always want to look for is going to be the water source. In this case, it's public. That's good news. We don't have to do a well addendum. So depending on the home, you're going to find different quirks about different properties. Some have wells, some have septic, some have some other things. So those are the primary things I'm looking for. That'll help me choose what I'm going to check on my purchase and sale agreement. And it will also allow me to know which forms I'm going to be choosing. So the next thing I want to look at on here is this little icon for 3 sheets of paper. It's the supplements. I want to know which documents the listing broker has provided for us. Some of them are going to be very, some are flat out necessary for our offer, and some are very good information for our client. So in this case, we've got a floor plan. That's good information. That is not a contract document. It doesn't need anybody's signature, but I would send it to my buyer. Seller disclosure, super important. We need to see that your buyer has received it. They need to acknowledge it with a signature. So we'll definitely be selecting that one. The HOA docs, the CC&Rs, very important to know what's going on in the neighborhood. Can your buyer do in the home what it is they hope to do? Sometimes there's CC&Rs that are very restrictive, and I had one of the ones I dealt with personally was a CC&R where the homeowners association said that person was not allowed to wash their car or do any maintenance of their car anywhere within the development, including in their garage or on their driveway. My client was he was a car maniac. So he backed out of the contract because of that. He wasn't going to try to fight the HOA on that, and he wanted to live the way he wanted to. So it's important to get these in front of your clients. Again, it's not a contract document, so it doesn't need signatures, but please be sure that you can verify that you gave it to your client. The preliminary commitment, again, this is an important document. This is the title company has said that they will insure this property. So it will, as far as we know right now, it meets all the criteria to close. The seller can transfer the property to your buyer. And we've got a legal description. This is required to be included with your offer. So you typically want to get your buyer's initials on it. If we open it up and look at it, sometimes depending upon what it is, it'll have language that you don't have to confirm, your buyer won't confirm. They're going to initial it saying they've seen it, but that's about it. The title company is going to compare the seller name, the legal description, the physical address, and the tax parcel to make sure they all line up. If for some reason they don't line up, then that's kind of an immediate red flag, and the title company will do more research to make sure your buyer is buying what they think they're buying. And then finally, going back here, we've got utilities addendum. That one is a form that you'll include with almost every offer. And it's nice when the seller fills it out in advance. If you're ever a listing broker, it's nice for you to things that you can fill in advance for a buyer. It simplifies things. It cuts down on back and forth, and it makes it easier to get mutual acceptance quicker. And then here is the FIRPTA. That's the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. We want to find out the tax status of the seller, because if we don't find out, it could leave your buyer with a tax deficit issue. As long as the seller tells us that they are a non-resident alien for purposes of taxation, in other words, they don't live here and they don't pay taxes, or I am not a non-resident alien for purposes of U.S. income taxation. That typically means they are a resident and they do pay U.S. taxes. We need to know one way or the other. It's when neither of those boxes is checked. This one, it's a little hard to see, but there's an X here on I am, or I am not, excuse me. So it says, I am not a non-resident alien for purposes of U.S. income taxation. You have to read it. It's kind of a funny sentence, almost a double negative in certain ways. But you just want to make sure that you know. If you don't know, you leave everything, and we'll show you this on the offer sheet itself. You're going to leave it blank, and the seller is required within 10 days of mutual acceptance of the offer to provide you with this 22E. If they don't, then your buyer has the right to terminate within 3 days of not receiving it. Okay. That's a whole different deal. Okay, so that's the basics that we want to cover off of here. The next thing we want to do is now open up Transaction Desk. And so I clicked on that little scroll with a pencil. You can choose a template where you can do a residential transaction. That's going to pre-feed some forms for you. So you'd hit create. This automatically pulls in the seller information and the listing broker information. That's why I really like using the Transaction Desk wizard for a lot of this stuff. If there's any of you out there who are so new that you haven't taken the Transaction Desk classes through the MLS yet, I'm going to really, really strongly encourage you to do so. They will save you so much time when you get a listing or when you're writing up offers for your buyers. Really, it's good stuff. So take those classes when you get a chance. In this case, we've got the seller is offering 2%. My buyer and I have talked and we've decided that, yeah, they've offered me 2.5%. I'm going to see if the seller will roll over and give us 2.5%. And then the purchase price, we're just going to pay full price. Okay, so I'm going to hit next. I'm just going through a couple of steps here. Today is going to be the date of our purchase and sale agreement. Our offer expires tomorrow. And that's all we'd fill in at this point. I'm gonna add a buyer. I'm showing you kind of some basics here. Some of you, this is old stuff, but I just want to be sure. So here we go. We've got my fake guy, Aaron Buyer. We're going to add Aaron Buyer here. Okay. And next, we've got forms. Now, this is where you can go through and clean this up. It automatically fills with a lot of forms. This home is newer than 1978. Therefore, we can delete the 22J, for example. We don't need lead-based paint because it's new enough. There's other forms here we don't need. You can go through and clean it up if you wish. You don't have to. It depends on your own personal organization. But the one thing I want to add at this point is we want to add a form, and it's going to be the 22WW. Okay, that's the Pierce County Septic Addendum. You want to watch, certain counties have different septic addendums. King County has its own. So we've got a 22S-KC would be the King County one. 22S is just kind of the generic septic addendum. Snohomish County uses that one. Skagit County has its own. It would be 22S-Skagit. Thurston County has its own, 22S-Thurston. Pierce County is the weird one. It's 22WW. There's no S for septic involved there or anything like that. Anyway, we're going to select that and add it. We're not going to go through that form today. If you get your first ever septic transaction, I want you to work with either me or your branch manager and just understand that septic addendum. There's so many of them for so many different counties, and they have a lot of different situations going on. That's the reason I want you to talk to us when you do your first one, especially, in fact, do your first one for any given county, and we'll talk about the requirements to go with that. So I've added that form, so it's now going to show up at the very somewhere there it is, the 22WW. So like I say, you can go through and clean this up all you want. Then when we hit next again, we're going to get documents. So forms are things that you can fill in. Documents are things that have already been filled in, and in this case, they've already been um, signed by the seller. Here's that FERPTA again. It's going to is here it is in this version. It's been signed by the seller, so it's been provided as a document. So forms are things you can fill in. Documents are things that you would be able to assign. You can also change them, but it means actually crossing things off and writing in with a text tool. Okay, so now we've hit done. Now I'm going to go back to forms, and we're going to dig in on the purchase and sale agreement, what you came to this class for, right? Okay, so here it is. First thing I want you to do is always be looking at the revision date, especially if you are a person who's inclined to save any forms on your computer or your laptop, your any device you're using. Every once in a while, the MLS changes their forms. They did so most recently in February of this year. So if you were to use the prior form, if you saved a form prior to February of this year, it would actually have a revision date of August of 2024, and it would no longer be valid because it has so many things that aren't current with the current law and MLS rules and that kind of thing. I recommend that you just use forms directly out of Transaction Desk out of the Northwest MLS Express forms as much as possible. If you do print up forms, say you're going to take a handful of forms with you to an open house with the hope that you're going to meet a buyer and write up something right there on the kitchen counter. And yes, I've done that in my career, and I recommend it. It's a nice thing to do. But that said, when you finish the day with those forms, you stick them away in your purse, or your backpack, your briefcase, whatever it might be. Those forms may expire on you. In other words, they may have a different revision date later on. So just be aware of that. When the forms change, get rid of everything you've got saved on your laptop or a physical form that you're carrying around as paper because it probably changed. And this form in particular, any of the purchase and sale agreements are the most likely ones to change every time there's form changes. The other thing I'm going to bring up is the first page is called specific terms. The subsequent 5 pages are all called general terms. So specific terms are things that you can specify. The general terms are things that are just general boilerplate language. And there's really nothing to change on anything after the first page here. First thing we're going to do is fill in a date on this date's important because it's actually going to be the guiding date for every single document that you use throughout your transaction. Even if you're doing an extension 30 days from now, an extension of closing 30 days from now, the first line on that extension says that it's related to the purchase and sale agreement dated. It's going to be dated July 7, 2026, even if you write it up on August 7, 2026. MLS number, that automatically fills if you're using the Transaction Desk Wizard. You can fill it in if it is MLS. If there's no MLS, say it's a for sale by owner, or say your buyer and your seller have an agreement, they're going to buy and sell from each other. That's fine. Leave this blank. If it is an off-market sale, by the way, you will have to turn in unlisted sale documents 3 days after closing. But be sure and reach out to me if you've got any questions about any of that later on. Okay, our offer expiration. We're going to learn later on in the language that everything expires at 9 p.m. unless you state otherwise. So right now I've got this set to expire tomorrow. Without saying anything, it automatically, by default, expires tomorrow at 9 p.m. I could, if I wanted to, change that by saying, oops, helps if I use a real hour, 5 p.m. So 5 p.m. on July 8th. So you can override by change, the default of 9 p.m. expiration on everything we do by writing it in somewhere. Okay, we got our buyer. There are going to be occasions. The most common one is where you have a buyer who is an investor and they would like to have their LLC purchase this property, but their LLC isn't completely finalized and formed yet, and so they're not there, but it will be in the next week, maybe, or something like that. It's going to be happening pretty soon, but they want to be able to switch it. Well, if you don't specify the word and or assigns, the seller can say no to you assigning this to that LLC. But if you put the language and or assigns in place here, that means that the seller if the seller agrees to your offer, they are obligated to accept that you're going to assign it to somebody else at a later date. The biggest concern for sellers when they see assignment is, well, wait a minute, who's getting the financing then? Is this going to jeopardize our closing and all the rest? They want to know more certainty about this. I don't want to talk too deeply about it, but there is a topic called wholesaling. It also involves and or assigns. If you're ever involved in a wholesale, that's um, where your buyer is going to be finding another buyer to buy within the transaction, and they're going to make some extra money doing that. It's really risky behavior. Brokers get sued over this far too often, and so we frown on it. If you're ever going there, talk to me or any of our branch managers before you even get started on that conversation because, like I say, it's so risky. It can be done. It needs to be done correctly. There's just a lot of steps that have to take place if you're going to do that. So we'll forget about that for the moment, though. If you ever hear the word wholesaling or novation, though, I want you to call a manager immediately. But in this case, it's just, Aaron here, it's going to be, he's got an LLC. He's going to transfer it to the LLC somewhere before closing. It just simplifies things for him. It's much easier and cleaner than doing a quick claim deed to the LLC later on. The seller in this case is undisclosed. We never know the reason for undisclosed. I mean, if Bill Gates is selling his home, we understand why it's undisclosed. A lot of sellers are just kind of private. They don't want their name out there. Maybe they're worried that neighbors or whoever is going to judge them, whatever it might be. You will need to get their name later. Escrow will anyway, and title will. Their name will get added to the PSA later. That doesn't change anything about your PSA. There's language in your purchase and sale agreement here that says that the seller name can be added after mutual without affecting your mutual acceptance date. And I know some of you are new, and I don't know how new. Hopefully, everybody understands the term mutual acceptance, but I apologize if I took that for granted. Mutual acceptance is when everybody, both the buyers, all the buyers and all the sellers, sometimes even the brokers, have agreed to all of the terms and have done so in writing and signed off on it. Okay, so in this case, you make an offer. If the seller just accepts all your term, you've got mutual acceptance. If the seller counters you and then you accept the counter offer, you've got mutual acceptance, that kind of thing. So it's going to be the date upon which everybody agrees to everything and everybody has signed off on it. Okay, here we go. I was talking earlier about what title is going to be looking for in order to approve the sale of this property. They're going to be looking at the tax parcel. They're going to be looking at the legal description, which we would attach to our offer. They're going to be looking for the word Exhibit A on that legal description. And then we've got a physical address. And like I say, they'll determine who the seller is at a later date. All right, on the listing, the home, they included the stove, the refrigerator, the washer, the dryer, the dishwasher, the microwave. By the way, these items are any appliance that is built in other words, it's built into the cabinetry. It's one thing to have a stove, an oven, and cooktop that are one big unit that you can slide out from the cabinets and sweep out all the stuff. In my case, in my home, my cat has knocked underneath the oven. Um, we can slide that out, sweep it out, and slide it back in. That is not an automatically included item. That is the stove and range that we're referring to here. Now, if there is an oven that is built into the cabinetry, a lot of times there's a double oven, maybe a microwave or a convection oven and a standard oven, and they're built into the cabinet. It's something that you wouldn't slide out. They are going to be bolted in place so they don't just fall out of the cabinets. Sometimes you see Sub-Zero refrigerators. That is also a built-in. So anything that is a built-in appliance is automatically included with the house. And we'll get to the language on that. But it's just good to know the difference when you're talking to your buyer about everything you're doing. To be safe, even if it's built in, always check the checkbox anyway. There's going to be some things here that you wouldn't necessarily check, but there's going to be some things with the home that maybe aren't as obvious. In this case, we've got attached speakers, we've got attached TV. So the question comes up sometimes, is a TV that is on the wall, is it guaranteed to be attached? I have a TV that is mounted on the wall, but all you have to do is lift it out of place. It's a bracket and it just lifts right out. It's not permanently attached. I personally wouldn't make the argument that it was not attached, but there could be sellers that would say, well, no, that's not attached. And all they do is they don't leave it. So if it's important to your buyer that any TV that's on the wall is included, I would check that box, and if it's a question mark as to whether it's attached, write it in here. Say, the TV in primary bedroom, something like that. There can be other things that are not necessarily obviously included, and we're going to hit some language here in a moment that will tell you everything that is guaranteed to be included with the home. There's going to be some items that are a little bit questionable. We're going to hear the word fixture a lot. Fixture usually means that it's affixed to the home, usually by bolts or built into something like, and a great example is a chandelier that has a chain running up from it. There's an electrical cord going through it, and then it drapes across the ceiling and runs down a wall and plugs into the wall. That's probably not an included chandelier because it's not permanently affixed to the home. Now, that same chandelier, if it had a wire that went up into the ceiling and went up into the cap, and it was all bolted in place there, and it didn't have additional chains running across the ceiling and down the wall, that one would be affixed. That's a fixture. So there's a lot of different elements for this. One of them this time of year is the air conditioners that are hooked up into a window. A lot of bedrooms have window air conditioners going right now. Some homes weren't supplied with central air, so people buy air conditioners. You can ask for it. It's probably not affixed. It's probably just built into the window. It may have a thing that'll pinch it into the window frame, but if it plugs into the wall, it's probably not a fixture. So you may want to ask for that. You could, in this case, so the AC in the primary bedroom. There are AC units in these houses a lot of times that are they're on rollers, and they have a vent that goes out a window. Sometimes they've got a drip tube that goes out a window. Those again are not built in. They're not a fixture in the home. No harm in asking for things like that. If it's important to your buyer that they move into a home that has at least some semblance of air conditioning, especially this time of year, good time to ask for that kind of thing. Another one that's come up recently more often than not is car chargers. So in the garage, there may be a charger. Some of those chargers are not actually permanent. They are, they may be bolted onto the wall, but they can be transferred easily. They may be plugging into a 220 outlet. Some of them are hardwired. And sometimes it's hard to know whether or not it's a permanent fixture. If it's important to your buyer that it remains with the house, write it in here. So, EV charger, that kind of thing. If it, like I say, if it's important to your buyer that it comes with the house, write it in here. If there's a lot of items that are important to your buyer that they want to come with the home, you could write here, see attached Form 34. For those of you who don't know, Form 34 is a blank addendum. On that blank addendum, you could write in all of the elements that they want to be included with the home, and cover it that way. But again, you're representing your buyer. You want to get them everything you can. Don't ask for too much in the way of personal property like couches and beds and tables, et cetera, et cetera. Something that goes with the house like an EV charger or an AC unit or, speakers, TVs, et cetera. That's okay, but your lender will not want to see too much in the way of personal property being requested, because they're not in the business of writing a loan for personal property at a comparatively low interest rate. Because if people want to charge that stuff, they're going to pay a much higher interest rate, and it's not going to be part of the house. So anyway, that's you put a certain risk into your lending if you ask for too much personal property. The next line, purchase price. In this case, we've got it written out numerically and longhand. Okay, $1 million US. You may go back and forth with counter offers. I would like you to be in the habit of any time you have to write in separately, you might cross off this million. Say you're the seller and you want to get $1,000,001, and you cross off this million and you want to write in $1,100,000. Cross off both, and then I want you to write it in numerically somewhere adjacent, and I want you to write it in longhand as well. The reason being is that you get too many back and forths, you get numbers that overlap other numbers, and all of a sudden a 0 looks like an 8, a 4 looks like a 9. Who knows? It can be a little hazardous. And if you handwrite anything, the handwritten numbers can be very hard for the escrow company to discern, and they may actually be writing up documents that have nothing to do with the actual number you guys think you're buying or selling the home for. So, like I say, just be sure if you write it out both ways, much less likely that there's going to be any ambiguity about the actual number involved. Earnest money. I get a question a lot of, hey, my buyer's making an offer. What's the right amount of earnest money? And really, there's no absolute right number on the earnest money. There's a couple of things for your buyer to think about. Number one, it's money that in theory, it's at risk. In theory, they could lose this money. So they need to know that. They need to be aware this money, if something really weird took place and they had to back out of the contract and couldn't get their earnest money back, this money is gone. It'll go to the seller. What can they afford? That's a big question. The other side of it is, how much money do they have accessible that's liquid right now? In other words, it's in a bank account and they could write a check on it and that check would clear tomorrow, that kind of thing. Then there's the other side, is what would a seller accept? And typically sellers are going to accept anywhere in the 1% to 3% range. If there's multiple offers, they're going to want to see a higher earnest money involved. Some sellers going to ask you to make your earnest money non-refundable and released to the seller. If you're ever getting backed into that corner because you're up against other offers, I'd like you to contact either me or one of our branch managers before you do that. There's ways to do it. There's language involved where we can protect your buyer as best we can, so that if the seller were to terminate the contract for a reason that wasn't your buyer's problem. Your buyer wanted to continue the sale, but the seller decided not to, and all of a sudden they've got the money sitting in their hands. And if you haven't written it up correctly, that money is the property of the seller, and it's really hard to get it back from the seller. But if we write it up correctly, at least we've got some protections in place for your buyer so that the seller can't do any monkey business and just keep the money for no good reason. The next line, oh, and by the way, the worst you can lose is 5% of the purchase price. So in this case, $50,000 would be the most earnest money your buyer could lose. Speaking of risking earnest money, your job as a broker is going to be to make sure that your buyer does all of the things they need to do and that they don't inadvertently violate any language within the contract and breach their contract. Therefore, if they fail to close, the earnest money would be lost. So the earnest money is not, losing, you're not going to lose your earnest money as long as you close. So it'll always apply towards the sale price. So that's the good news. If you close, doesn't matter what your buyer does. It's when your buyer does something and then they don't close that we want to be sure that they're doing it in a way that prevents them from losing the money when they fail to close. Earnest money needs to be turned in within a given period of time. The default is going to be 2 days, and that's in the contract language. It says 2 days. I would like you all to be in the habit of writing in the number of days on any of these, even if there's a default number of days. Another example of that is up here on the offer expiration. We could leave it blank. It automatically expires 2 days from now. That's the default at 9 p.m. But your buyer's not going to know that. The seller's not going to completely understand that. You're going to have to explain it to them. It's a good chance that dates are going to get missed. So if there's dates to fill in, please fill them in. If there's a number of days to fill in, please fill them in. This is the day that your buyer has to deliver and deposit their earnest money with the escrow company. Or it could be, there could be law firms that handle escrow. So we're going to call it a closing agent. Closing agent is more of a generic term for anybody who handles the closing and will be transferring the funds at closing. So if we fill in the default 2 days, great. So by contract says that it's going to be by 9 p.m. 2 days from now. That would be Thursday, which is what, the 9th? Thursday the 9th at 9 p.m. But a lot of escrow companies close their doors at 5 p.m. So your buyer's going to want to deliver it prior to 5 p.m. to the escrow company. You can handle the earnest money for your client. We prefer that you don't handle the check or whatever it is. Unfortunately, there have been situations where brokers have lost a check. I've heard of one where it blew out a window in their car. They left it on the seat of the car. They were driving down the road. It blew out. They couldn't find it afterwards. Their buyer had to put a stop payment on that check, and then they had to cut another check, that kind of thing. It horrifies me to tell you this, but I have found checks sitting on the copy machine in the office. Please don't copy checks, by the way. Don't scan them. Don't make this is private information. There's account numbers. There's routing numbers. People could hack this and actually cause problems for your client. So I prefer that you don't ever make photocopies of this stuff, and make sure you hang on to the check. If you receive the check, you have to give a Form 89, which is an earnest money deposit, to your client. Then you have to go to the escrow company and you have to get another receipt from the escrow company showing that you've given it to them. So it's much easier to just skip a step in there and have your buyer personally deliver it. That way you're not responsible for a lost check if something were to happen. And it's on them if it doesn't make it to the escrow company on time. It's not something where they could hold it against you that their earnest money didn't happen. So if your client doesn't deposit their earnest money by the deadline, they have technically violated the contract. They've breached the contract. The seller can immediately terminate. So at 9 p.m. on Thursday, if that earnest money, if you can't produce a receipt showing that you've actually deposited it, your seller could terminate the contract, and they could still sue your client for that earnest money. So make sure your client understands how important it is that it gets delivered on time. If your client can't deliver it in 2 days, find out when they can do that and do that. By the way, 5 days or less, and we'll get into this, 5 days or less does not include weekends or holidays. So say we had mutual acceptance last Thursday, then today would be day two because Friday, Saturday, and Sunday wouldn't count. Monday and Tuesday would be day one and two. Okay, we'll get into that language a little further later on. If it's 6 days or more, it does include weekends and holidays, but it can't end on a weekend or holiday. If your client is going to mail the earnest money from somewhere else, be sure you put in plenty of time here for the mail to get there because it needs to, even if it's overnight, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get it the next day. And what if you didn't? Even if the FedEx or post office said, yes, it'll arrive tomorrow, but then for some reason it didn't, and you put in 1 day here, that could leave your buyer in a lurch. They could actually lose the opportunity to buy the house. So put in plenty of time there. Put in some buffer time if it's something they're not going to hand deliver. Next line, to be held by. The first checkbox is buyer brokerage firm. As a buyer broker with Skyline, we do not have a trust account where we can deposit the fund. So you're never going to check that box that says buyer brokerage firm. Closing agent, which is typically going to be an escrow company. Agent is more of a generic term for a party that handles it, the party being a company. It could be a law firm, whatever it is, but more often than not, you're going to check closing agent. There can be times where you do a promissory note. Those are going to be really unusual times. Most sellers will not accept a promissory note, but there are commercial situations or vacant land situations, sometimes multifamily, where people defer the deposit of the earnest money until after they've cleared certain hurdles. Then a promissory note might be appropriate. I recommend if you're ever going to be doing a delayed earnest money deposit, talk to your manager or myself as you do that so we can kind of guide you through the right steps to do that. Default. Default means your client has defaulted on some clause within the contract and therefore they're not going to close. So you're going to check one. In this case, you're going to check forfeiture of earnest money. Never check the box that says seller's election of remedies because, especially if you're the buyer's agent, the seller can actually sue your client for more than the earnest money in that scenario. And they could sue your client to force them to close, even if it's going to be a hardship for your buyer to close. So if you stick with the forfeiture of earnest money, the worst thing that will happen to them if your client fails to close without a contractually legal reason to fail, then they would forfeit their earnest money to the seller. Title company, in this case, we had next title for the title company is what it said on the listing. They didn't give us a title number. If they had, you could plug it in right here. That helps when you turn in the transaction. Your buyer, by the way, the seller chooses the title company. The listing broker will typically open up title with a company. If your buyer were to counter that and say use some other, say you typed in First American here, your buyer could actually get charged the next title fees and the First American fees because you've made that change. So typically you're going to agree to go with the title company that the seller has requested because they've usually already put everything into works. Title companies are required by the insurance commissioner in Washington to charge for their services, so that there's no thought that maybe they're doing something. They're not allowed to give anything away. Let's just put it that way. So that's the reason they have to charge for it if they even open up title, and that's the reason that the contract says your buyer could have to absorb both title fees if you change title company. Now, closing agent, that is going to be negotiable. There is no law that says that basically you don't even open things up with an escrow company. That again, escrow company and closing agent are one and the same. Um, you're not even going to open escrow until you have a completed mutual acceptance. So therefore, it's completely optional. There are several escrow companies out there that offer the buyer a free home warranty if you use that. One of them we work closely with is In-House Escrow. You'll see them at a lot of our events and that kind of thing. The owner of In-House Escrow is actually a licensed real estate broker, and he hangs his license with Skyline. So you could use In-House Escrow. They're not in-house with Skyline per se. It's just the name of their company is In-House. There's a couple of others out there that are independent escrow companies that offer things like that free warranty because they can do that. In this case, they named a closer. So let's say that we have no problem with using Next Title as the escrow company as well. And I think, well, it was Jessica something or other. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so you can see here underneath it says company. Be sure and put company here. And the individual, that's going to be the closer. That's where you can specify who the closer is. As you do more and more business, you're going to come to find out which closers are horrible to work with and which ones are wonderful to work with. I won't name names, but there's a couple of closers out there that if I see their name on something, I am not going to write it in. They've given my client bad service. In fact, maybe made a mistake or two that I had one situation where a closer almost cost my client a transaction because of an error. So I don't want to work with that closer anymore. I need people who make me look good. So in this case, I don't know Jessica with Next Title, but we'll roll with it. If you're in a mutual offer situation, a lot of times the listing broker will be highlighting this area as one area that they'll be making comparisons as to whether your offer is the one they want to take or not. So depending on your circumstances, this can be an area where you can be competitive, but it's also where you can exert your own independence. If you have somebody who you really, really, really want to work with, you can negotiate that here. Closing date. So we're going to plug in a date here. Let's say we have talked to our lender. By the way, always do this. Talk to your lender. Find out how soon they think that they would be ready to close this transaction. If they tell you 30 days is great, then awesome. Put 30 days in here. So 30 days from today. Today's the 7th, so we'll go with August 7th. And that is a weekday. You always want to check that because you cannot close on a weekend. Okay. The county recording office isn't open on weekends and holidays, that kind of thing. So anyway, we've chosen a closing date 30 days from now. And normally you're going to have possession date on closing. Now, interestingly, you're going to close sometime in the afternoon of August 7th. You'll get notice from the title company saying they've got recording numbers and that it is closed. Say that happens at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Possession, by definition, in the contract says 9 p.m. So you've got this 4 or 5 hour gap where your client owns the property, but they're not allowed to possess it. The possession has not switched. The seller can move out right up until 9 p.m. on that possession date. If you ever feel the need to change that possession date, type in other and say, on closing 5 p.m., something like that. The other thing that happens occasionally is possession can happen after closing, where maybe the seller's going to stay in the home for a few days after closing so they have time to move out. Then there's a Form 65B. So in that case, you'd say, see attached Form 65B, and it's going to specify how many days or when that excuse me, when that possession date is going to take place. There's also a situation occasionally where a buyer moves in prior to closing. And in that case, it would be same language, just Form 65A. And that language is actually mentioned on page, it's either 4 or 5 in our BSA, so you don't have to memorize those forms right now. It's actually built into the language, and you can look it up real easily later on. Okay, scrolling down a little bit here, we get to the services of a closing agent for payment of utilities. Almost always going to say requested. And that's the Form 22K. That'll say which utilities apply to that home. Title will pay off every one that they can pay off. They will guaranteed to pay off the lienable utilities, which is usually going to be either sewer and water more often than not, one or the other or both. Um, those the charges stay with the home. That's why they're lienable. Electric, cable, telephone, all of that stuff is not lienable normally. Therefore, it doesn't stay with the home. So it's guaranteed the title will pay off the lienable utilities, but quite often they will pay off the other utilities as well. You can waive that, but I don't recommend it. And I can't say in any of the transactions I've ever written or reviewed that it's ever said waived on that line. Charges / assessments levied before but due after closing. Break that down just a little bit. So you've got charges against a property, usually made by an HOA. Sometimes there's other reasons for it. There can also be assessments that are also things that are made by an HOA, more often than not. They can be levied before. In other words, the seller, the owner of the property, is given notice that this charge is going to take place. And it could be that it's several charges over several months, that kind of thing. It's usually a fixed amount over a many month period. That's like condominiums have assessments all the time. Say when they're replacing the roof for all of the buildings in the development, and they don't have enough in their reserves to pay for those roofs, they're going to take out a big master loan to pay for the roofs, but they're going to charge each unit a given percentage of that total. And that'll be typically done in a loan basis over a number of months. It could be a couple of years, it could be many years. But anyway, that's the levied part, is that they've told the homeowner, we're going to be charging you this amount. The but due after closing part is that there's going to be ongoing payments that take place later. Charges, the most common thing we see for charges is in King County, any home that is 15 years old or newer may face what's called the King County sewer capacity charge. And there can be some older homes that also incur that charge because they had septic and now they're being forced to connect to the sewer system. The county appreciates that it's a big hit to pay, $25,000-$30,000 to connect to the sewer. So they allow you to do it on a monthly, or it's actually a bi-monthly payment. It's called a King County Sewer Capacity Charge. It helps pay for the connection to the sewer. It also pays for any of you who don't know about it, somewhere between Woodinville and Bothell, there's a giant sewer or sewer capacity or sewer treatment plant, excuse me. It's called Brightwater, and it was something. It was phenomenally expensive, and the county offsets that by charging. Every new home that is built has to pay a certain amount to King County, but again, it's going to be billed out. So it'll be billed out over time. Typically, it's a 10 to 15 year payment. It's typically around $60 to $70 a month, right in that range. So that's going to be your charge. Here's your options on all of that. Your buyer can say yes, I'm fine with making that payment after closing. So I will make the monthly charge or, charge payment, or I will make the monthly assessment payment. Or you can negotiate. You can start by saying, hey, seller, you're going to pay all of that off out of your net proceeds at closing. If the seller counters you, that's a good time to find out, well, wait, what are the charges or assessments that are out there? What are we looking at? Title company will ultimately tell everybody what those charges and assessments are. But again, if you can get the seller to just pay them off out of their net proceeds from their closing, that's the best way to do it. Remember the FIRPTA form we looked at earlier, the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act? It's Form 22E, the citizenship one. We know, we looked at the FIRPTA form. It says that the seller, in that case, it said, I am not. But in this case, seller is not, is the equivalent. And we can check that box with confidence because we've seen the form saying so. Information verification period. You have two choices here. One, you can choose an expiration date to verify information, or you can satisfy it or waive it. In competitive situations, we see a lot of buyers check the satisfied waived box. But for most situations, it gives your buyer a chance to verify certain information. So the listing broker and the seller provided information. It's the information that is on the listing when you look at it on the MLS. It could be in other documents that the broker has provided. It could be on the Form 17 that you see certain things. If it's been misstated, to be kind, if it's completely false, whatever it might be, your buyer has a chance to verify, hey, wait a minute, is that for real? And if it's not for real, and if it has material value, in other words, monetary value, we can measure the value of what that misinformation created. So say the seller says it's got a brand new roof, and your buyer, maybe they went out there on, maybe they saw the house in the dark and they couldn't see the roof. They wrote up the offer, and 2 days later they drive by the house and they take a look and they see that the roof is horrible. That would be the type of information that would have material value. That roof adds value to the property, or in this case, would subtract value. Your buyer has a chance to actually terminate their contract if they see that there was some type of material value misinformation provided from the seller or the listing broker. It defaults at 10 days. If you want to use that 10 days, my experience is most sellers don't want to give you 10 days to do that verification. They're going to cut you back to usually 3 days or less, that kind of thing. But it's, again, you can offer whatever you wish, and the seller can counter you with whatever they wish there. But again, it defaults at 10 days. If you're going to use the default, please write in 10 here, just so your buyer knows, and so there's no question about that. Agency disclosure. Buyer is represented by, in this case, you, the buyer broker. The seller, do they have a broker? They do. It's this Cameron at EXP, so we've got a listing broker. If you're ever working with one side is unrepresented, please don't do dual brokerage. We don't allow it, so don't check these middle boxes ever. But say the seller, in this case they are represented, but say it was a for sale by owner, you could check unrepresented. You would leave all this information down here about the broker and brokerage blank. And then you do a Form 42. So you can do that. Talk to one of us if you're doing it. That way we can coach you through doing it correctly. Unrepresented parties, they feel as though they are represented way too often. So we want to make sure you're taking steps to make sure they understand that they're on their own. But in this case, we don't have to worry about that. We've got sellers represented by the listing broker. Buyer brokerage compensation. So this is that challenging topic. This is Chun Fang. This is what you were asking your question about. And so the seller in this case offered 2%. Your buyer offered you 2.5%. You could write in 2.5%. Um, and then if the seller doesn't counter you, the seller has to pay your buyer 2.5%, which your buyer would then pay to you. Um, there are times when the seller is offering more than your buyer. So say the seller offered 3% and your buyer only offered you 2.5%, and your buyer still wanted to get the other 0.5% to themselves, you would check this addendum for buyer credit, and then you do a form 41C. 41C is that addendum, and you'd fill that in real quick, and then you could actually ask for that difference. That doesn't happen super often, but when it does, that's the way you would handle that. You only use this box if the seller is offering more than the buyer is paying. You don't use this box if you're going to be giving some of your commission to your buyer towards their closing costs. That is done with there's a notice form, Form 90. You would write on there, buyer broker shall contribute, $5,000 towards buyer's allowable closing costs. You'd write that on that Form 90, and that's where you would negotiate that. That's a separate thing. This is only if the seller is offering more than your buyer can get the difference. Now, in this case, the seller is offering 2%. You're asking for 2.5%. What if the seller came back and scratched off the 2.5% and wrote in 2% anyway? You've got a Form 41 with your buyer saying the buyer's going to pay you 2.5%. Technically, the buyer has to pay you that amount. You could still negotiate that with your buyer. So in this case, $1 million getting 2%, that's $20,000. That's not a bad payday, right? So you're not going to ask your buyer for the other 5,000. You're going to do a Form 41A, and that's an amendment to the buyer brokerage services agreement. And you would write on there that it would be 2% for this specific property. And that way you can assure your buyer that they're not going to have to pay you that difference. All right, now moving down into the addenda, this is where you're going to say, these are the documents that I am attaching to my contract. These are contract documents only. They don't include Form 17, which is the disclosure. That's not a contract document. That is a required by state law document, but it's nothing that can be negotiated between the buyer and the seller. Same thing with the FERPTA. That's not negotiated between the buyer and seller. It is what it is. This is going to be the documents that are negotiated. So we've got our financing addenda, has to be signed by the buyer and the seller. That's a perfect example of one. 22D are optional clauses. I want you to always include optional clauses with your contract. There's reasons that it's always there, but there's some clauses there that are very important. In this case, we are going to be asking for utilities. We include that. Inspection is a common one here. There's other things. By the way, I'd like you to get in the habit of using there's a couple of addenda that are becoming more and more important that we didn't use all the time in the past. One of them is the title contingency. If upon review of the title, your buyer were to find out that there's something in the title that troubles them, they can ask the seller to remedy that problem. A lot of times it has to do with easements and things like that. And then the seller has so many days to remedy that problem. And if the seller can't remedy the problem, your buyer has the right to terminate. So that's an important one. The other one that is becoming more and more commonly common is the 22VV homeowners insurance. Kind of scary anymore. How many homes either A, cannot get insurance, or B, are really expensive to insure. This form actually gives your buyer an out if the homeowners insurance either isn't available. By the way, your lender on financing will not finance a home that cannot be insured. But it also, if the insurance is going to be too expensive, this gives you an out. So I'm starting to recommend these. We didn't recommend them so much in the past, but they're becoming a real issue anymore. So think about using those. Our inspection is the next one that we would, oh, excuse me, you know what? We also need to do the Pierce County septic addendum, and then inspection. If you're going to waive your inspection, you would use Form 35W, insurance or inspection waiver. We're not going to waive it. We're going to ask for an inspection. We use Form 35. Speaking of waiving, if you and your client talk and your client says, well, I'm okay waiving my inspection, please get it in writing that your buyer signs off. That's the Form 35W, the inspection waiver. If they say, yeah, I need to get my financing, but you know what? I've got enough money in the bank that I can close even if I can't get financing. I would just like to try. Therefore, I'm going to waive my financing contingency so I can be more competitive. There's a way to do that in writing. Don't just leave the financing addendum out. Now, if they're paying cash, you'll leave the financing addendum out. That's easy. But if they're trying to get financing and they would like to have those clauses built in, and like to understand the rules that the contract lays out for them on that, then you would definitely use a financing addendum. There's other things if you ever want to waive them. There's ways to do it properly. And when I say properly, again, in writing and either signed or initialed by the buyer, so the buyer can't say later on, well, I didn't even know I could do an inspection, or I didn't know that I had an option to have an out under my financing, or um, they believe me, when things go wrong and your clients lose their earnest money, they're going to look for everybody they can find to reimburse them that earnest money, and a lot of times it's going to be their own buyer broker. So we want to make sure that we get any waivers in writing. Talk to your manager or myself about how to do that in a way that protects you. Looks like we're good to go. So now we're going to move on to page 2 of the PSA. And the big thing here is just to note the term general terms. These are terms that aren't intended to be changed. And part of the reasoning behind that is that we as real estate brokers, under it's a state law that it's actually case law. It's called Colton versus Heritage House. It allows us to deal with language that's been pre-written. We are practicing law, but in a very limited way, and it's limited primarily to things that are pre-written, in this case by the lawyers with the Northwest MLS and the state legislature and things like that. That's the reason we want you to be careful if you're ever using anything where you are writing up any kind of language that you're devising. Even if you were to go to AI or something like ChatGPT, we've had some brokers who have used those to try to write up language, and we always want to scrutinize that stuff really carefully. There's just a lot of standards that we have to meet if we write up language, and it's not just as simple as saying it's something, one thing. There's going to be who does what that is, what the consequences will be if they don't, that kind of thing. So there's a lot that goes into it. The other side is protecting the parties involved, especially the ones we represent. So anyway, if you're ever thinking about writing language on a blank addendum or something like that, it's one thing if you're just saying, hey, I'm giving up part of my closing costs, and you're putting on a Form 90, or there's some simple language you can do, changing of the expiration date of the earnest money deposit. Yeah, you can write that out real simply somewhere. We're not gonna fuss over that. As soon as though you get into anything where there could be pretty dire consequences for one or the other of the parties in the contract, we want to be really careful with that. Okay, so moving into general term A, purchase price. By the way, this is the clause that says that your client is paying cash. You don't have a special addendum for cash. This is the cash clause right here. but it also limits if things that it limits them that if they are using any other tools, if you will, then that because they're not paying cash, say they're getting financing or they're using funds that they don't have or something like that, this limits that. So anyway, the language says, by the way, I apologize in advance. I'm going to be reading a lot over the next hour and a half to you. I know I already talked to you for the first hour and a half, but this class is a little less student involvement and more teacher talking at you, and I apologize for that. I know if I had my way, you guys would be talking for as much of the class as I do. So this class just doesn't work that way, though. Okay, buyer shall pay to seller the purchase price, including the earnest money in cash at closing, unless otherwise specified in this agreement. So there it is. The buyer is saying they have the money to close. Okay, they have the cash. They have access to it. If they don't, that's the otherwise specified in this agreement. So then we go on to say kind of the same thing, only different. The buyer represents that the buyer has sufficient funds to close this sale in accordance with this agreement and is not relying on any contingent source of funds, including funds from loans, the sale of other property, gifts, retirement, or future earnings, except to the extent otherwise specified in this agreement. Going back through that sentence, it says, they're not relying on contingent funds. It says including funds from loans. Okay, that's where we include a Form 22A. We're making the funds contingent with that form. The sale of other property, that we use Form 22B, that's contingent upon sale. If it's already under contract for sale, the home they have to sell in order to buy this home, then that's a Form 22Q. So the sale of other property is handled by either a 22B or 22Q saying, hey, seller, we're going to close on this, but we have to sell this other property first. Gifts, if your client is relying on gifts from anybody, unfortunately, I've seen this happen twice in the last year, and that is where parents or other relatives have agreed that they were going to give their client a substantial gift that was going to allow them to close on the property. And I don't know what exactly the dynamic was between those parties, but for some reason, one of them decided, you know what, we're not giving you the gift after all. Well, they're already under contract. They are dependent upon whatever it is, and in one of them, I remember it was about $100,000. They were dependent upon getting that money in order to close. They couldn't get financing, for that different amount and everything else. They not only didn't get the house because they weren't able to close, but they lost the earnest money too. So whichever relative it was that decided to hold back on the gift that they had promised them, left them pretty high and dry. They were in a bad place. But if there's gifts involved, the best idea is have those gift funds transferred to your buyer prior to them writing up their offer. That way they don't have to worry about it being contingent. They've got the money. The other side of it is that gift funds can mess with your lending. A lot of lenders, they want to know where the money came from. So one thing to get a substantial gift, it's what was the source of the funds that created that gift anyway. There is a lot of concern about money laundering out there right now. So therefore, gifts have to be proven that they're not illegal funds or money laundering funds or things like that. So lenders and escrow title companies are all looking at gift funds to make sure that they're coming from a good place. Retirement funds, if your client is going to be taking a loan from their 401k or IRA or something like that, they're actually potentially going to be facing tax penalties if they don't do it the right way and pay it back in the right period of time. And if they have to pay it back, is that going to create a situation where the lender says you can't get a loan because your debt ratio is messed up by taking a loan against your retirement. A lot of things to consider there. Future earnings. This would be crypto. It could be stocks. It could be um, anything where they think they're going to have a certain amount of money available to them. My recommendation again is that if they're, especially if they're dealing with crypto, because we have seen some really volatile movements in crypto where people may think they have the money in their crypto account to pay cash for this house, and 2 days later they have half of that money available to them anymore. They wouldn't want to go under contract with that risk going on. They should probably cash out their crypto, as painful as that might be. Cash out or their stocks. There can be some pretty volatile stocks out there as well. To make sure they've actually got the money in hand before they write their offer. That way, it's much more likely they're not going to face a situation where they can't close because they didn't actually have as much money as they thought they did. Because in that case, because they've actually stated they've got cash, there's no form for contingent upon future earnings. They would not only not be able to close on the house, but they would lose their earnest money too. So that's very risky. Moving on here, this is kind of a different topic in the same paragraph, and that is the parties shall use caution when wiring funds to avoid potential wire fraud. Before wiring funds, the party wiring the fund shall take steps to confirm any wire instructions via an independently verified phone number and other appropriate measures. You, as a broker, shall not ever send wire instructions from an escrow company to your buyer. Here's why. There was a case, it took place in Wisconsin. A buyer broker sent the wiring instructions that he received from escrow to a buyer. Somehow, hackers intercepted that email. They changed the wire numbers to an offshore account in the Caymans or wherever, and then they continued the forward onto the buyer. So the buyer, and these guys are really crafty. I don't know how hackers do it. I'm not wired that way. But we know that they did it because it actually was a case law situation in Wisconsin. So the buyers received this false wire transfer document, and they proceeded to transfer their down payment of $200,000 to an offshore account somewhere that they had no control over, and it was not related to the escrow company. Their broker had provided them with those numbers, even though the broker didn't know that he had provided them with bad numbers because it got intercepted between him and them. Well, their funds were never received at escrow. They didn't have funds to replace it with. They weren't able to close on the purchase of the home. They lost their earnest money because of it. Yes, they were really, really grumpy. They turned around and they sued everybody. They sued the title and escrow company. They sued their broker. They sued the listing broker. They sued the seller. They wanted to get their money back, if nothing else. They lost everything else. It was a massive problem. It went to court. By the time all the dust had settled, the party that was found liable was the buyer broker, for he was the one who used a Gmail account. It was found not to be secure. It was able to be grabbed by hackers and altered and then sent on. He didn't know he did anything wrong, but he was found liable for it. Nobody else was found liable. Then they decided, because it was such an egregious error, that it could have been prevented so easily, he was charged what's called treble damages. So that $200,000 turned into $600,000 this broker now owes his former client, the buyers. So my warning to you, never ever transfer escrow or transfer the wiring instructions. Instead, you're going to have your buyer talk to your closer. The closer is going to send a document to your buyer. It'll be secure. Most of your escrow companies have secure transfer. Your buyer is then going to call their closer on a direct number, hopefully like a cell phone, something where the phone call can't be intercepted. Or it couldn't be, it's not going to be a phone number that's on the wire transfer document itself, because that could be, again, that could be manipulated by hackers. So just warn your client to do all of this stuff. Okay, tell them to call their closer, have the closer send them the wire transfer numbers, call the closer again, verify these are the numbers I received, and then go ahead with the wire transfer. That's the safe way to do it. That way they don't run the risk of their money being absconded with by bad guys. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph, and this is actually a huge 2-paragraph clause here. We're going to read very little of it. So the earnest money, the buyer shall deliver the earnest money by the delivery date listed in specific term number 7. Okay, that was where the default on the earnest money, it defaults to 2 days, and you can see there, that's where it says 2 days. Again, going back to that blank, we want you to fill in 2 days, even if you're using the default, just so your buyer can't say, well, I didn't even know where to look in the contract to find how soon I had to do it, because they don't know how to read this contract to find dates. So anyway, so they're going to deliver the earnest money to the party holding the earnest money. Then in parentheses, it says buyer brokerage firm. That doesn't occur because Skyline does not have a trust account, so you're never going to do that. But it's going to be to the closing agent. If sent by mail, the earnest money must arrive at the closing agent by the delivery date. So again, give a little buffer time if they're mailing it. Even if they're overnighting it, give them 3 days to get it in, because we've seen stuff happen there. And then it says here, if the earnest money is held by the buyer brokerage firm, well, we're going to stop right there, because you as a Skyline broker, your firm does not have a brokerage firm. Therefore, you don't have to deal with the rest of it, where you have to, where it says how much interest is going to be earned on that money and who's going to report it to the IRS and all this other stuff. That's the reason we don't mess with having a trust account, because there's so many hoops to jump through between the DOL and the IRS and some other things. So the rest of this paragraph is something if you're ever a listing broker, you might get an offer from a buyer who works for a firm that has their own buyer brokerage firm account. Those are pretty rare, but it happens. In that case, the rest of this paragraph would be applicable, but you generally don't have to worry about it. The second paragraph is what happens if there's an earnest money dispute. So say your buyer backs out of a contract and the seller wants to make the allegation that your buyer didn't back out for a contractually legal reason, and they want to keep the earnest money, and your buyer says, no way, I did too back out for a contractually legal reason, and I should get my earnest money back. That's where the earnest money dispute starts, and that is where this paragraph kicks in. So if the earnest money sits at escrow for too long, the escrow company is going to open interpleader, which basically means they send the case to the court for that specific county. There will be an automatic $750 charge to both the buyer and the seller. The buyer and the seller are going to have to hire attorneys, and that can cost them $5,000 to $10,000 each. The loser at interpleader is going to have to pay the legal fees for the winner, so the grand total for the loser could be between $10,000 and $20,000 in legal fees. It's a mess. We hope it never gets to that. By the way, it very rarely goes to what's called interpleader. Usually it's going to be a settlement between the two parties as to who gets how much of the earnest money. Sometimes it's very unreasonable of one party to state that they get the earnest money. They're being irrational. That'll usually maybe escalate to where managers are talking to managers in this transaction, that kind of thing, who then have to talk to either the buyer or the seller and get them calmed down and acting rationally. So that happens occasionally, but you're very rarely going to have to deal with interpleader. That's why we're not going to read this paragraph. But now you know kind of the basics of interpleader. And this, if you actually did go to interpleader, this tells you what the basic steps are going to be. Okay, moving on. We talked earlier about the The stove, the refrigerator, the dishwasher, washer, dryer, microwave, etc. That was in specific term number 5. If you check the boxes, you can have it. If you don't check the boxes, you don't get it, even if the seller is including it. So say the seller said they were including the washer and dryer, and you don't check the box for the washer and dryer, so the seller turns around and sells the washer and dryer on Marketplace or something like that, your buyer will not receive that washer and dryer at closing because you didn't check the box. So it's real important that you check the appropriate boxes. It should be offered by the seller, and it must be in or on the property, or the seller isn't required to give it to you, even if you check the box, and they don't counter you there. So that's the basics on that is, again, must be in or on the property. If it's offered by the seller, check the box and get it. If the seller doesn't offer it, but it's in or on the property, and you check the box, but the seller doesn't counter you, you still get it. But if it's not in or on the property, you're not going to get it no matter what. So the seller doesn't have to run out and buy a washer and dryer just because you checked a box, even though they don't have one on the property. So here's kind of the language goes with that. The first sentence kind of applies to specific term number 5, those check boxes. Any of the following items, including items specified in specific term number 5, if the corresponding box is checked, located in or on the property, are included in the sale. So we know about those specific terms. Now here's the things that are going to be included no matter what. Remember I was mentioning built-in appliances? Here it is, built-in appliances. So anything that can't be just slid out from between the cabinets is probably going to be built in. If it bolts into the wall, it's built in. A microwave on a hood up above the stove, and it actually has the vent hood up there, that's a built-in appliance. Things like that. Wall-to-wall carpeting. Curtains, drapes, and all other window treatments. That includes blinds, valances, everything. If your client sees it in the house, it should be there when it closes. That way your client doesn't have to measure windows and order things in advance, figure out what they need, so that they can have privacy the day they move in. Window and door screens, awnings, storm doors and windows, installed television antennas, ventilating, air conditioning, and heating fixtures. Remember I mentioned AC in the window? That's not a fixture. But if it is like those mini splits you see in a lot of the modern homes, they're a box that's probably about 3 feet wide by a foot square. Those are mini splits. They usually have a conduit that runs down the outside of the house to a condenser compressor unit that's outside of the house. There could be multiples of those on a given home. Those are a fixture. They're bolted to the wall. They've got wiring that runs outside to something that's secured outside of the house. Anything freestanding that plugs in is not a heating or air conditioning fixture, but you can ask for it. Trash compactor, garbage disposal, fireplace doors, gas logs, gas log lighters, irrigation fixtures. So if it's attached to a hose, it's not a fixture. If it's buried into the ground and you turn it on using a switch or something, maybe electronic device in the garage, that would be an irrigation fixture. Irrigation is watering the lawn or plants, that kind of thing. Electric garage door openers, even though they're plug-in, they are bolted to the ceiling, so they are considered a fixture. Water heaters, installed electrical fixtures, lighting fixtures, shrubs, plants, and trees planted in the ground. If they're in a pot on a deck, not included. You could ask for them, that kind of thing. And then it says, and other fixtures. So again, the fixture word is kind of the key thing. If it's permanently attached to the home, it comes with the home. If it's not permanently attached, you would have to ask for it. And then finally it says, and all associated operating remote controls and access permissions. Remote controls, the garage is the obvious one. But typically when there's ceiling fans, there's going to be a remote control. If there's TV or speakers left behind, there's going to be a remote control. I've seen a lot of fireplaces with remote controls. One crazy modern house that I sold about 2.5 years ago had the equivalent of a tablet, an iPad type of thing, mounted on the wall. You could take that tablet down, but from that particular thing, you could control the heat, the cooling. Those are fairly, if you got a Nest device or something like that, those are fairly standard anymore. But you could run the dishwasher from this tablet. You could turn on the stove or the oven from this tablet. You could add extra time on the microwave. It was really quite the impressive technology home. So that one, you had to have what's called access permissions. Not everybody could control those things. So you had a PIN basically that would use, or other type of biometric type of thing, like fingerprint or Face ID. Um, all of that needs to be provided. If there's a Ring camera on the home, the buyer is not going to have access to that Ring camera unless they know how to access it using the QR code that's on the back of the device, that kind of thing. But there could be other permissions granted. Anyway, make sure you get all those. You, as the buyer broker, keep reminding the listing broker to do this. You kind of have to be on them sometimes. Make sure they're giving you all of this information. And then it goes on to say, unless otherwise agreed, if any of the above items are leased or encumbered, seller shall acquire clear title before closing. So we see several items that can be leased items. One I just dealt with last week, I think it was. Puget Sound Energy used to have a program where they leased water heaters to people. They've suspended the program, but it's still grandfathered, where if somebody if they leased a water heater from Puget Sound Energy, they pay a monthly fee. Every 10 years, that water heater is automatically replaced. And if it dies somewhere less than 10 years, it's automatically replaced. So it's just a thing that they do. That's one of those items that would need to be paid off, because Puget Sound Energy will not allow a transference of the lease, so it'd get paid off at closing. That's just one example. That can happen occasionally with certain things, some security systems, propane or other fuel tanks, that kind of thing. Condition of title, we're not going to read this whole paragraph. This just basically says that the property is marketable for closing. The title company will make that determination. The title company could choose that it's not marketable, and if that happens, then the property, it will not close. End of story. There will be no loss of earnest money. Both the buyer and the seller, they both lose. The buyer can't buy the property, seller can't sell the property, and it's usually because of some huge problem. The most common reason I've seen it is gigantic IRS liens that the seller can't pay off from closing, and the IRS won't let them out of it. Therefore, they're not going to have a marketable title. The rest of this paragraph talks about the things that will not affect the marketability of title. So it just covers a handful of things. Like the most common one is that people see around here on the east side is mineral rights for the property, because you've heard the term Coal Creek, you've heard Black Diamond, there's Squawk Mountain and Issaquah. All of those are coal mines, massive coal things going on where there's all kinds of mineral rights underneath the property. Those do not affect the marketability of the title, though. That's just one example. And if you ever read your title report, you may see more of those. The title insurance clause. This says what kind of insurance there's going to be. In this case, it's going to be an ALTA. That's the American Land Title Association. They write the policy that all of the title companies use. So it's the ALTA form of homeowner's policy of title insurance for a 1 to 4 family residence. On your Form 22D, there's a place where you can override this by checking a box. One of them is for a standard policy of title. That's a less inclusive, less comprehensive form of title insurance. Not as high quality. It'll cost a little less, not much less. If you check that box, you don't get the policy here in Clause E. Instead, you get the one on 22D, which is less. You normally don't want to do that. The other one on 22D is the extended title policy, and that one is so complex that it includes a complete survey of the property, which can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to do a survey. Um, the buyer is going to eat that survey cost, something you don't normally need. If it's a really complex property, if it's waterfront, if there's weird boundaries, if it appears there's strange easements through the property, then yeah, it might be a good idea to do the extended title policy. Um, but for your typical home in a typical subdivision or like City of Seattle, just in your average city home, that kind of thing, it's pretty well defined what their title situation is going to be. You don't need to get the extended title. So where I'm going with that on Form 22D, it's super rare that you would ever check the boxes for title there because the title policy that is given to your buyer in paragraph E here covers them. This goes on to say that the seller is going to buy a title policy for the buyer. The buyer is going to buy a title policy for their lender. So therefore, they're both basically splitting the cost of who gets the title policy. Um, and it talks a little bit about insurability of title and that kind of thing. The next paragraph, though, we're going to read every line of it. This is one of the most important general terms in your entire contract. General term F covers a lot of topics. First one, this sale shall be closed by the closing agent on the closing date. There it is. So, if you need to close, there's weird situations where the county cannot give you recording on the day that you think you're going to close. In that case, you would do a form that's a 22Y-recording that changes the definition of what a closing date is. So, and it says that the closing date can be the next day that the title or that the county can enter the recording. It's a somewhat rare situation. It happens occasionally, but anyway, this is basically just defining the closing. If the closing date falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday, or a day when the county recording office is closed, the closing agent shall close the transaction on the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, legal holiday, or day when the county recording office is closed. We don't see county recording offices closed very often, other than weekends and holidays. We've seen it primarily due to crazy snowstorms. We saw it a little bit during COVID. So it does happen, but right now, not common at all. There are times when the recording office closes before they can finish all of the closings for that day. That's a different situation. Well, that's that 22Y recording. It's basically a change in the definition of what closing is. And here's that definition for normal transactions. Closing means the date on which all documents are recorded and the sale proceeds are available to the seller. That's it. So sale proceeds available to the seller means there could be a check that's waiting for him at the escrow office. Could be that escrow has initiated a wire transfer, but maybe it hasn't hit the seller's bank account yet. If your seller says, I'm not giving up the keys because because I haven't seen the money yet. No, they may not see the money, and it may be a couple of days if it's on a Friday because it won't happen probably till Monday when their bank is open again for wire transfers, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's the basic definition there. Speaking of keys, the seller shall deliver the keys, garage door remotes, and access codes to the buyer on the closing date or on the possession date, whichever occurs first. There's a lot of debates out there. Brokers who don't read this particular paragraph don't know what the actual rights of the buyer are. So the buyer is entitled to receive the keys on the closing day. It doesn't say after it's recorded, because that could be after 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. It doesn't mean after possession, which is by definition here on the next line, is going to be at 9 p.m. on the closing day. You as a buyer broker should probably be in touch with the listing broker and say, hey, what are we going to do about the key exchange? And it could be they're going to leave the key box up. You're going to swing by and grab the keys whenever it's convenient to you on the closing day. And then you can give them to your buyer whenever it's convenient to you and the buyer on the closing day. Here's the thing though, your buyer can't go on the property. They definitely can't go and turn the key and enter the house until possession, which by definition in the next line is going to be 9 p.m. on the closing day. So, and here's where that says that buyer shall be entitled to possession at 9 p.m. on the possession date. The seller is entitled to possession up until that 9 p.m., even though the property deed has already been transferred to the buyer probably hours prior to that 9 p.m. time. So the seller has until about 9 p.m. to move out, finish their cleaning, all of that. Set that expectation with your buyer, unless you write on the closing and possession line that it's going to be, say, at 5 p.m. instead, that kind of thing. Talk to me or one of your managers if you ever have questions about changing that for any reason. Okay, let's see. Seller shall maintain the property in its present condition, normal wear and tear accepted, until the buyer is provided possession. So, present condition, what does that mean? Well, it's the day, present is the day you write the offer, right? So, however you saw, especially if you saw the house today and you wrote the offer today, a month from now, that home should be in the same condition that it was in today when your client saw it and wrote their offer. The seller shall maintain the property in its present condition, normal wear and tear, accepted until the buyer's provided possession. Seller shall either repair or replace any system or appliance, including but not limited to plumbing, heat, and electrical, and all included items. Remember that on general term C up above, all those included items, they have to be in proper working order and in the condition they were in when your client first saw them on the time that you do your walkthrough and definitely at closing. So seller shall repair or replace any system or appliance, including but not limited to plumbing, heat, electrical, and all included items that becomes inoperative or malfunctions prior to closing with a system or appliance of at least equal quality. So that's huge. Say you did an inspection, everything was working at your inspection. You didn't ask for anything. You move forward, you do your walkthrough only to find out that the stove isn't working. You could contact the listing broker and let them know. And technically the seller needs to either repair or replace that stove. It could be the furnace, it could be the AC, it could be any of those items included in general term C, that kind of thing. So you definitely want to give them notice. This is a reason you want to do a walkthrough, and that's the next line, by the way, to make sure that you can check these things in advance. There's no guarantee the seller's going to be moved out when you do your walkthrough. There could be boxes all over the place. The home may be in a little bit rough condition. Shouldn't be that there's any damage that the seller doesn't intend to repair. But if you spot it, then you can point it out and make sure that the seller does indeed repair it prior to closing. And that becomes a negotiating thing. Let's see. So here it is. The buyer reserves the right to walk through the property within 5 days of closing to verify that the seller has maintained the property and the systems or appliances as required by this paragraph. You don't, if at all possible, you don't want your buyer to miss that walkthrough, because if they move in and it could be several hours or days later, they discover that something isn't working that should have been working that they maybe would have caught at their walkthrough, the seller has the plausible ability to say, no, that happened after closing. And there's no way to prove otherwise because you didn't do your walkthrough. Okay, so do your walkthrough. Again, within 5 days of closing. The closer to closing, the better, in my opinion. Let's see, the seller shall not enter into or modify existing leases or rental agreements, service contracts, or other agreements affecting the property, which have terms extending beyond closing without first obtaining buyer's consent. That all makes pretty good sense. If there's a tenant in place, don't extend their lease while you're in contract with a buyer without consulting with the buyer first. And if you're a buyer in that situation and you intend to buy the home and keep the tenants in place anyway, then roll with it. Okay, let's see. If possession transfers at a time other than closing, the party shall execute Northwest MLS Form 65A, which is the rental agreement where the buyer moves in prior to closing, or Northwest MLS Form 65B, the rental agreement. The seller continues to stay in the property occupancy after closing, or alternative rental agreements. I don't recommend alternatives if you can help it, mainly because, again, we get into that drafting legal language that is not necessarily legally approved. If an attorney writes it for you, cool, run with that. Make sure the attorney's name is on it. And if you do any of this pre or post occupancy thing, it's a good idea that all parties contact their insurance companies, because it changes who's responsible for insuring the structure or who's responsible for insuring the contents of the structure. All of that can be very different depending upon who's occupying the property versus who owns the property. Next paragraph just has to do with the fact that the property is required to have smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors that meet all code and legal standards. If you're a listing broker, make sure your home has smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, because contract number one, your listing agreement says it has those things, but any buyer you get, if they get either an appraisal or an inspector, they're going to be calling for those items too. It's the law that the home should come with working smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Next paragraph is you've probably all heard of a 1031 exchange. This is the paragraph that speaks to that. If either of the parties is doing a 1031 exchange, then this says what the duties of the other party are going to be, which is basically nothing. So it's just a notification that, hey, we're doing this. It could impact some of the things we're doing, but we still intend to close. 1031 exchange, if you're ever working with investors, because it cannot be a primary home, but it's a chance for an investor to defer their capital gains upon sale to another property. But they have to do a bunch of steps that meet IRS provisions. They have to have a 1031 intermediary who will be basically holding the funds after closing to then provide to the what was the seller who is avoiding or is deferring their capital gains. That money from the seller sits in the hands of this intermediary, who will then distribute the money when that seller buys a property that meets IRS standards. So anyway, I recommend you take a class on 1031 exchange if you're going to be working with investors, especially 1031 investors. There's a company in Kirkland called IPX 1031. They do a lot of classes. First American Title has, they do 1031 exchange classes. A couple of the others, Fidelity does them as well. And they actually are all intermediaries as well. So you want to, it's a good idea to take those classes, understand it. what I just told you in a couple of minutes is nothing compared to the 3-hour class that they will give you and give you all kinds of strategies for your investor, buyer, or seller. Next paragraph talks about the split of all of the charges and assessments, who's going to pay what at closing. And so you can read that. It's going to come out on the settlement statement as well that you'll get from escrow right at closing. Next paragraph is sale information. The buyer, the buyer needs to be aware that their purchase information is going to be available to the public through the Northwest MLS. This is the FERPTA thing that we talked about earlier. The big thing I want you to remember is right here. It says if, oops, I can't highlight it, but if the seller fails to provide the FERPTA certification, that was at Form 22E, to the closing agent within 10 days of mutual acceptance, the buyer may give notice that the buyer may terminate the agreement at any time 3 days thereafter. And the reason the buyer would do that is because the IRS says that the buyer may have to pay a tax penalty if the seller wasn't identified and the proper funds were withheld from the seller at closing if they were a non-resident alien who did not pay U.S. taxes. There's a pretty substantial tax hit. It's 10 to 15% of the purchase price goes to the IRS from escrow if the seller is not a resident alien and do not pay U.S. taxes. Okay, notices of delivery of documents. We're not going to read the first paragraph. The second one is very important. Starts off with the word facsimile transmission. Some of you are going, what is this facsimile of which you speak? It's a fax machine. Faxes back in the day when I started in the industry were how we transmitted our offers to another broker. We didn't use email. We weren't allowed to. The good news about faxes, they give you a receipt saying that, hey, the other side received 21 pages. You count what you sent over. Hey, good, that was 21 pages. Therefore, it all went over. That was the nice thing about faxes. Faxes had some other problems that were a whole different deal. But with email, there's no way to prove that any one party has sent an email or that the other party has received the email. So the Northwest MLS came up with a way to do that, and that is that you must include the broker email on the other side and the broker firm email on the other side. I'm going to quickly roll up here to this first page. See right here where we've got a listing broker email address. So in this case, it's info@jennacameron.com. And we also have a firm document email address, wa.contracts@exprealty.com. Any document that you are sending to another broker, I want you to always have their email and their firm, because you need to be able to prove that you delivered the document. So here it says email transmission of any notice or document or direct link to such notice or document. That's when you use AuthentiSign. You'll have a link to a document quite often. Shall constitute delivery. In other words, we can prove that it was received at the other side when the email is sent to both the buyer broker and buyer brokerage firm, or both the listing broker and listing brokerage firm at the email addresses specified on page 1 of this agreement. So if you're sending a form, do you and your client a favor and always send it to 2 addresses. Just have that at the top of your head. I need to send this to 2 email addresses, and look at the first page of your PSA, the other side of the transaction, and send it to those. That's the only way to prove you've done it. So say you're in the middle of a transaction and you're on the last day of your inspection. And that means that on that last day, you have to deliver it by 9 p.m. And say it's getting to be, 7:30 p.m. and you send over that document to the other broker, but you don't include the firm email address. And the next day, you find out that the other broker is telling you that, hey, you waived your inspection rights because you didn't respond in time. You say, no, I did. Well, you'd have to be able to prove that you sent it to both the other broker and the other firm in order to have your argument stand. Okay, so it gets into a negotiating point. Luckily, this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we want you to be able to prove you did it. If you forget to include the other email address, it happens, then number 2 applies. Buyer broker or listing broker provide written acknowledgement of receipt. So you send off your inspection response to the other broker. It's 7:30 at night. You forget to include their firm. You could resend it immediately with their firm involved, but you could also send a text message and say, "Hey, did you receive my inspection response?" And if they respond back to you and say yes, then they've given you written acknowledgement of receipt. That's all. That works too. But don't depend on that, because some brokers are not very good about answering their texts or emails or anything else. So be sure you send it to 2 email addresses and you're going to be covered every time. If you're dealing with an unrepresented party, the email is sent directly to that party's email address specified on page 1 of the agreement, and that covers you. A for sale by owner house, for example, they're not going to have a firm email address to send it to as well. You're just going to send it to whatever their basic email is. Although I would follow up and make sure that they got it anyway, because I just want to know my transactions going forward. Computation of time. This is a very important paragraph as well. I'm going to try to simplify it for you. So everything expires at 9 p.m. on the last day of a specific period of time. If there is a specific date mentioned, that specific date is going to be the deadline, so it expires on that specific date, unless it's a closing day that happens on a Friday, Saturday, or a legal holiday. Then then it's going to move to the following day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday. Let's see, so 9 o'clock. So any period of time that's less than 5 days does not include weekends or holidays. So say you're doing a 5-day inspection, then that 5 days does not include weekends and holidays. So if we wrote it up today on Tuesday, it would be due next Tuesday. That's 7 calendar days away, but it's only 5 business days away. Anything 6 days or more is considered to be calendar days, and it does include weekends or holidays, but it can't end on a weekend or holiday. So say you put 6 days for your inspection, then that would actually end yesterday, or excuse me, on Monday, not yesterday. It would end on Monday the following week. So it's actually 6 days is less than 5 days if there's a weekend involved, interestingly. On the 4th of July weekend, some of you may have seen my post on Facebook where I mentioned about fun with computation of time. And that was at 5 days. If you had mutual on the day before the 4th of July, 5 days would actually be 10 days, because there's only because of the number of days involved. So anyway, there's ways to play with all of that. So that's the basics. Now I'm gonna read this. I'm gonna skip everywhere where it says RCW or when it says the county recording office is closed, that kind of thing. That's all redundant stuff we've already covered. So unless otherwise specified in this agreement, any period of time measured in days and stated in the agreement shall start on the day following the event commencing the period and shall expire at 9 p.m. of the last calendar day of the specified period of time. That word event commencing the period, so mutual acceptance, that's an event that commences a period. So the next day is day one. When you respond on an inspection, the seller is then on the clock. So the day you respond is the event commencing the period. The next day is day one for the other side of the transaction, that kind of thing. Hopefully that makes sense. Except for possession date, if the last day is a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the specified period of time shall expire on the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. Any specified period of 5 days or less, except for any time period relating to the possession date, shall not include Saturday, Sunday, or legal holidays. If the parties agree that an event will occur on a specific calendar date, that event shall occur on that date, except for the closing date, which, if it falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, shall occur on the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. When counting backwards from closing, by the way, this hardly ever happens except on your walkthrough. When counting backwards from closing, any period of time measured in days shall start on the day prior to closing. And if the last day is a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the specified period of time shall expire on the next day moving forward that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. If the parties agree upon and attach a legal description after the agreement is signed by the offeree and delivered to the offerer, that's the buyer and the seller, then for purposes of computing time, mutual acceptance shall be deemed to be on the date of delivery of the accepted offer or counter offer to the offerer rather than on the date the legal description is attached. The reason that happens is sometimes a listing broker will order title. Title company is slow on getting them the legal description, and maybe they're under contract already. Or it could be it's a for sale by owner, and nobody even knew they were going to be under contract the following day, and they open title that same day. You can add the legal description later, and that's okay. Next clause, integration of electronic signatures. Yes, you can use electronic signatures. I've been around this business long enough to know there was a time when that was not the case. Assignment, we were talking about the and or assigns earlier. It says here the buyer may not assign this assignment or this agreement or the buyer's rights hereunder without the seller's prior written consent unless the parties indicate that assignment is permitted by the addition of and or assigns on the line identifying the buyer on the first page of the agreement. Remember when I did that earlier? That's why I did that. So it's the only way to guarantee the seller will be forced to say yes to that. Default, in the event the buyer fails without legal excuse to complete the purchase of the property, then the following provision as identified in specific term number 8 shall apply. In this case, it's going to be forfeiture of earnest money because you're not going to check that box for seller's election of remedies. Seller's election of remedies says the seller may A, keep the earnest money, or B, bring suit against the buyer for seller's actual damage, or C, bring suit to specifically enforce the agreement and recover any incidental damages, or D, pursue other rights or remedies available by law. So your buyer could get sued if you choose the second one. The first one, they just lose their earnest money. And here's where it says that portion of the earnest money that does not exceed 5% of the purchase price shall be forfeited to the seller as the sole and exclusive remedy available to seller for such failure. Okay, moving down to general term P, professional advice and attorney's fees. If your buyer wants to have an attorney look at things, yes, please tell them yes, you are entitled to do so. If either of the parties sues any of the other parties, it says here, or does an interpleader action, the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. Prevailing party means the winner in a lawsuit or interpleader. Offer. The offer must be accepted by 9 p.m. on the offer expiration date unless sooner withdrawn. Now, you can also put a different expiration time there, but if you don't put a time, it's going to be 9 p.m. Let's talk about withdrawal of an offer. We actually had two different scenarios in the last 8 months where brokers got sued because they didn't, or they ended up incurring a lot of costs, that kind of thing, because they didn't withdraw their offer promptly. So if you're a buyer's agent making an offer and you submit the offer and the seller has not signed off on it yet, and your buyer calls you up and says, wait, we just found another house that we think we like better. Can we get that offer back? Yes, you can. There's a form called a 36A. It's a withdrawal of offer or counter offer form. You need to have you need to fill it in, have your buyer sign it, and you need to deliver it. 2 email addresses for delivery. Remember that. This is when it's really important. Send it over to the listing broker before the listing broker has sent back an acceptance of your offer. If you do that, the offer is withdrawn and you can get out of it. The other side is we're going to get to counter offer, but very similar. A counter offer, if you receive a counter offer, or excuse me, if you extend a counter offer and it hasn't been accepted yet, and then you get another offer in, and you think it's a better offer, you need to withdraw your counter offer ASAP. The same way, get the seller to sign off that they're withdrawing on that Form 36A and get it delivered to the buyer broker before you accept another offer. Here's what happens. We had this happen. One of them was a buyer made an offer. The seller countered that, and the buyer broker told the listing broker, yeah, we're probably not going to agree to your counter, but didn't do anything in writing. And then in the meantime, the listing broker got another offer, which they accepted. And about 10 minutes later, the first buyer, also accepted the counter offer that the seller had sent over. All of a sudden, you've got a situation where a seller has accepted two offers on their house. How do they get rid of one of them? Well, that becomes a case for the courts more often than not, and there's going to be a lot of expenses. The other one is that we had a situation where a buyer broker submitted an offer, and it was a multiple offer situation. They were told by the other broker, yeah, we're probably going to accept another offer. It feels like it's higher than yours. So then in the meantime, that buyer made an offer on another property entirely. That offer got accepted. Then in the meantime, the seller decided they wanted the buyer's offer instead of the other one that the listing broker thought they would take. And so all of a sudden, this buyer's buying two houses. Well, again, getting them out of that situation unfortunately required expenses on their part because there were lawsuits involved. So there was lost earnest money on one side, you name it. So it gets messy. So be sure, the biggest thing here is that make sure that you deal with things, you withdraw them promptly if need be. Okay, so acceptance. So it says here the offer must be accepted by 9 p.m. on the offer expiration date unless sooner withdrawn. And then it says acceptance shall not be effective until a signed copy is received by the other party or by the other party's broker or at the licensed office of the other party's broker pursuant to General Term K. That's where those two emails come in. If the offer is not so accepted, it shall lapse and any earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Counter offer, basically the exact same concept, except the counter offer must be accepted by a given time. But moving on to the next one, S, offer or counter offer expiration date. If no expiration date is specified for an offer or a counter offer, the offer or counter offer shall expire 2 days after the offer or counter offer is delivered by the party making the offer or counter offer, unless it's sooner withdrawn. So Any blanks on expirations of offers and counteroffers automatically makes 2 days. Um, there's reasons that that might be a good idea, but normally your client is going to be itching for an answer, so you might want to make it shorter than that. Agency disclosure, you are going to give your client pamphlet number P1 in the MLS Forms. That's the real estate brokerage in Washington. By law, they must receive a copy of that, so make sure you get a copy of that to them. And it explains agency way better than this paragraph does. Brokerage firm compensation, we covered this earlier when we were going over line 17. By the way, it can be line 18 or line 19, depending on which purchase and sale agreement you work with. But it's very important. If you do not fill in B, you're not entitled to get paid. Okay, so you must fill in B. B is going to be the amount that your buyer said they'd pay you on Form 20 or 41. And 17B, let's go back up there really quickly here. This is so important. We had a couple of brokers not get paid since this law came in, and it's heartbreaking because they left this blank. That means that there is no amount to be paid by seller. So whatever your buyer wants to get credited so that they don't have to pay you, this is where you're going to put it. Okay, so that's this the firm compensation section. We're not going to do the lead-based paint. There's a form for that, Form 22J, that covers lead-based paint rights for both buyer and seller. We talked about the information verification period. I'll read it. It's fairly short, but it kind of talks about it again. It defaults at 10 days. Like I said earlier, you may want to do shorter. Sometimes you waive it. Unless satisfied or waived, the buyer shall have the time period set forth in specific term 15, 10 days after mutual acceptance, if not filled in, to verify all information provided from the seller or listing brokerage firm related to the property. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer gives notice identifying the materially inaccurate information. That materially word is key. There's a value to it that can be measured, dollar amount, information within the time period set forth in specific term 15. If the buyer gives timely notice under this section, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded. By the way, when the buyer gives notice that they're terminating, there is the inspection form 35R is one way they can terminate under the inspection, but otherwise terminating, by the way, is a notice. It's a one party is the buyer can say, I'm out, and the seller doesn't have any say in the matter. As long as the buyer is doing it within the legal bounds of the contract. There's a bunch of Form 90s. There's 90A is for disclosures. The buyer wants to terminate due to the disclosures. 90I is where the buyer wants to terminate because they're financing. There's a bunch of them though. So anytime it says here, the buyer gives timely notice under this section, there's a good chance there's a Form 90 that is that timely notice that you'd have to provide. So just watch for those. If you're ever in a situation where your buyer's backing out, that's where you're probably going to get the form that gives them the right to terminate. Property disclosure disclaimer. This is a huge paragraph. We're not going to read all of it, but you as a broker are not required to know everything about a house, right? You're going to know what's obvious. You're not required to investigate. If you do investigate, then you're required to say what you know. But the recommendation is that you don't do any more than you have to there, not because you're lazy, but because you're gonna tell your buyer, get a home inspection. You're going to be telling your buyer, read the seller disclosures, things like that. And also on the contract, if your buyer or seller does something illegal and therefore can't complete their purchase or sale of the home, it's not your fault. And this is the paragraph that says so. So anytime your buyer says you should have known or it's your fault, there's actually a good chance that you didn't have to know, and it wasn't your fault because of this paragraph. Let's read like the first 3, 4 lines. The buyer and seller agree that, except as provided in this agreement, all representations and information regarding the property and the transaction are solely from the seller or buyer and not from any broker. The parties acknowledge that the brokers are not responsible for assuring that the parties perform their obligations under this agreement, and that none of the brokers has agreed to independently investigate or confirm any matter related to this transaction except as stated in this agreement or in a separate writing signed by the buyer. Um, this is basically giving you the right to say to you, I mean, and you guys really are not. You are not licensed to be attorneys. You're not licensed to be CPAs. You're not home inspectors. You are not contractors and builders. I mean, there are some brokers who do these things. We have some licensed attorneys, licensed inspectors. We have builders, whatever, who are licensed with Skyline. They're held to a little higher standard on some of this stuff. But you guys, if you're not any of those things, then you can't be held responsible for those things. So don't ever overstate and say, oh yeah, I know everything there is to know about a house. And all, and, oh, that spot on the wall looks like mold. That's when you say to your buyer that, that, yeah, you probably have an inspector do that, or have have a mold specialist come out and look at that kind of thing. So don't get yourself in hot water by overstating your capabilities here. And if you read the rest of this paragraph, it says all the things that you're not responsible for knowing. And again, I'm not saying that in a in a lame way where you're just passing off excuses. This is truly, you don't want to be held to those standards because it can be really costly to you if you were in a lawsuit. Fair housing, again, your buyer and your seller should not do anything that violates the federal, state, county, or city fair housing laws. And this particular paragraph actually has the City of Seattle fair housing law is what it's basically stating, which is one of the most comprehensive fair housing definitions in the nation. So that's the reason they use it. So the federal one doesn't cover anywhere near as much as this one does. So this becomes the guiding thing here. Let's see, and then there's finally Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That's FinCEN. When a buyer is buying a property for cash, or they're buying a substantial portion of the property with cash, a substantial down payment of cash, and they are legal, they're a legal entity. They could be a legal liability or a limited liability company, a corporation, etc. Then they're going to be scrutinized for money laundering, basically. So if you're working with a buyer who's paying cash, just let them know, hey, you're probably going to have to fill out a form or two with the title company that they're going to send to the IRS, and it's basically saying that, for the most part, you're probably not laundering cash. If somebody is buying a lot of properties for cash and the IRS gets wind of it, they may decide that it's money laundering. For those of you who don't know, people can receive illegal funds from all kinds of different things, and then they invest those illegal funds into a legal thing like buying a house, and then they sell that house. Then they've got the money, and it now came from the sale of the house, not from the illegal enterprise earlier. That's called money laundering. So that's what they've done, is they've cleansed this money. So the U.S. Treasury is scrutinizing this pretty heavily these days. Just let your buyer know they're probably going to have to fill in a form if they're paying cash for the property, or if they're paying a substantial down payment. Okay, so that's it for Form 21. Anybody have any questions before we move on to the next form? I'm going to look at chat and see if there's anything new there. I don't see anything new, so that's all good. Okay, we're going to move on to Form 22A, which is your financing addendum. We are not going to read it in a huge way. We're just going to talk about it in more of a high level. Open that up. It's your financing addendum. Again, check the date. Make sure you've got that 226 revision date on there or later. If it changes again, which there's going to be some form changes coming up in about a month here, as last I heard. So it could happen. Anyway, this is where it says the following is part of the purchase and sale agreement dated. This is where I was saying the date is so important on the upper left-hand corner of your PSA, because that date is going to be this date on every form you do that is part of this contract. First paragraph says what kind of loan your client is going to get, and your client, this is a contract. When they check a box that says that they're getting a conventional first mortgage, if they were to try to get a loan for something else and then fail to close, they could lose their earnest money. So tell them that, hey, if we check the conventional box, you've got to apply for a conventional loan. There's an other place here. That's where you can put in if it's hard money or if it's going to be financing coming from other source. This is anytime the financing is going to be contingent. The next section says that the buyer shall make a down payment in the amount of, again, this is a contract, so this is what they are guaranteeing they are going to do. If they should fail to close because they couldn't meet the criteria in this line, they would lose their earnest money. It goes on to say the buyer shall make application for the loans to pay the balance of the purchase price and the application fee if required for the subject property within, it defaults to 5 days after mutual acceptance of the agreement. So they've got 5 days to apply. Pre-approval is rarely the same as applying. Okay, applying means they've supplied, and it actually goes on to say it here. Application means submission of the buyer's financial information for the purposes of obtaining an extension of credit, including the buyer's name, income, social security number, the property address, purchase price, and the loan amount. Those last three things are really what sets it apart from pre-approval. They don't have an address yet. They don't have a purchase price yet. They don't have a final loan amount yet. So if your client hasn't provided those to the lender, then they probably didn't apply. Follow up with your buyer. Make sure that they did apply. Follow up with their lender. Make sure that they did apply. The reason being is if they didn't apply within that 5 days, they lose their earnest money if they can't close. Next paragraph kind of reiterates all of that. If your buyer fails to make application for financing within the agreed time, if they change the type of loan at any time without the seller's prior written consent, or if they change the lender without the seller's prior written consent after the agreed upon time, or finally, they change lender from, this would be if you were pre-approved, say with movement mortgage, they got pre-approved movement mortgage. If you put it here, you're saying they are going to apply here as well. If you don't fill this in, say they got pre-approved with Wells Fargo, but then they decide to go with movement mortgage. If you didn't put it here, they can change that lender within the first 5 days. They have to apply within that first 5 days with any lender they want. But if they don't follow those rules, they have waived their financing. Waive means if they cannot close because of the error that they committed there, they're going to lose their earnest money. It also says that they are waiving their ability to use an appraisal as a reason to terminate their contract as well, or negotiate the appraisal in general. They waive their appraisal clause if they waive anything by improperly doing it in these 2 paragraphs. Now we've got a different type of waiver, and this is where a seller has to ask your buyer to waive their financing. It's called notice to perform. So you check a box. The default is going to be using A. The default is also 21 days. 21 is frequently going to work on a 30-day mortgage. If it's more than that, you may need more days. What that is on day 21, the seller can send a notice to your buyer saying, hey, waive your financing. And the buyer then has 3 days to make a decision that they are going to waive their financing. If they ignore that, if they choose not to waive their financing, then the seller has the right to terminate the contract. Buyer will get their earnest money back in that situation. So it's important to put enough days here that your buyer can find out that they're going to be good to go. So you might ask the lender, hey, how many days do you think it's going to get for underwriting approval? And that's the number of days you might put for this. Okay, because you don't want your buyer having to make a decision that they are either going to waive or maybe lose the house if they don't even know where they stand with their lender at that point. It goes on down here, and the last one is, this one is different from above, where you automatically waive your appraisal if you waive anything in 1A and B. But here in 2A or B, you can choose whether or not you're waiving your appraisal. If you check will not, buyer's waiver of the financing contingency under this paragraph 2A will not constitute waiver of paragraph 5 appraisal less than sales price. If you checked will, it means they will waive their ability to use the appraisal clause, but only if they are forced to waive. So if the seller never sends you the notice to perform, your buyer never has to waive. Okay, so they are good to go all the way up until closing at that point. I talked about not waiving financing. If you have a buyer who wants to waive their financing, the way we want you to do it is check this box 2B. That's the automatic waiver of financing contingency. Now, it could be that on day 21 is the default, your buyer automatically is waiving, and therefore, if they can't close because of something having to do with financing other than appraisal, they're going to lose their earnest money. If they close, doesn't matter, it's all good, but it's when they don't close that they lose their earnest money. They also have the similar appraisal clause here. It will or will not. So again, you can go with the default number of days, but if you're going to waive your financing from day one, put 0 in this. So the financing contingency shall conclusively be deemed waived unless within 0 days after mutual acceptance, buyer gives notice of termination of this agreement. So basically, if they would, yeah, they could terminate the same day they write it, but that would be the only way that would work. So this is the way you waive your financing. Put 0 days there, and then if you also want to waive your appraisal clause, this is where you put it. This is going to be usually reserved for the buyer who knows they're super good to go in their financing. Maybe they have enough money to buy the property whether they got financing or not. They don't care if it appraises. They feel as though their offer is one that is, an appropriate amount anyway, and they are comfortable paying that amount, that kind of thing. Okay. If your client is asking for closing costs, here in section 3 is where you would put that. So you could check a dollar amount and you want $10,000 in closing costs. There it is. Okay, you can offer that. It could be a % as well. Section 4, by the way, the stuff I'm not reading, I didn't bring this up earlier. There's a couple of things of homework here. When I sent you out all of your stuff, I want you to do practice transactions with your managers or with myself. Send us purchase and sale agreements. We will review it. We'll give you feedback. The feedback may be, wow, you nailed it. It may be, hey, why did you do this and this? I'd like to understand your logic. Or it could be, you missed something entirely and we need to talk, that kind of thing. So it's not a bad thing. We want you practicing on us, not on your clients. So that's one type of homework we want you to do. Do 2 or 3 of those with us. That's great. The other thing is we want you to read your contract. We didn't read every paragraph of everything. So tonight, read Form 21, paragraph A, right? And then tomorrow, read B. And B was 2 paragraphs, so maybe read B1 tonight and B, or tomorrow night, and B2 the next night, that kind of thing. Read those paragraphs, read them 2, 3, 4 times, get to know the language. I do this because your clients are going to be impressed if you can answer a question without saying, oh, wait, I don't know, or let me get back to you, or whatever. While it's okay to say that, I don't want you to be ever afraid to say, I don't know, or let me get back to you. Some of the stuff, it's really nice if you just know it right up front. You can just kind of give them those answers. So start reading through your forms, and it's going to be a 5-minute exercise every day to read 1 paragraph. So it's not a huge task, and I want to keep it easy, bite-sized chunks. Start with 1 paragraph today, do a paragraph tomorrow, read it 3 or 4 times. If there's anything in that paragraph you're not understanding, don't be shy about calling me or your manager, and we'd be happy to help you understand the language better at that point. Okay, so these are just good things to do, and ultimately it's going to turn into business for you because your clients are going to be impressed that you know the contract language to the contract that you're asking them to sign. Okay, going back here to Form 22A, earnest money. This is where it says that you must provide proof that you applied for the loan on time, that you applied with the lender you specified, that you have the funds to close, including closing costs and down payment, and that the lender gave you a denial letter, and the denial was for a contractually legitimate reason. If you can't provide all that, your buyer may lose their earnest money if they fail to close. Here's the appraisal clause. If you find out that the appraisal came in low, your buyer has the right to start negotiating with the seller. You have to give them a Form 22AN and a copy of the appraisal within 3 days of receiving the low appraisal. And then the seller has the right to ask for a reappraisal. The seller can go ahead and drop their price to the amount the appraisal said the home is worth. You can negotiate where the buyer and the seller split the difference between the offered amount and the price that the appraisal says. Or it could be the seller just says no to everything. Then your buyer has a right to reply to all of that. The rest of this is just some basic boilerplate. If you're working with FHA, VA, and stuff like that, you're going to have to do an amendatory clause. It's already built into this form, but you're going to have to, the government mandates that you provide one signed by both the buyer and the seller closer to closing anyway, so you'll end up with almost this identical language on a separate form later on. Okay, we're going to zoom on to Form 22D really fast here. Just again, I want to show you a couple things. This form you're going to use on almost every transaction. So again, this is where you are not going to check a title box unless you talk to your manager or talk to your title company. Make sure it makes sense for you to check one of these boxes. If you're ever selling a home that's been foreclosed upon, a lot of times the lender is going to demand a standard owner's coverage. Talk to your title company, find out what that means to your buyer. Usually it doesn't mean too much. Let's see, seller cleaning. This is saying if you check this box, the seller must clean the property. It doesn't mean that they're going to do a professional cleaning. It doesn't mean that they're going to have a carpet cleaner come in and do the carpet. But it does mean that they will do what I would call using a paper towel on the countertops and the bathrooms and sweeping or vacuuming. So really basic cleaning. They can't leave piles of debris and rubbish laying around. If they do, and your buyer moved in and your buyer had to hire somebody to do the cleaning, then your buyer could actually sue the seller for the amount they had to pay for that cleaning. And by the way, when you do your walkthrough, you're not going to know if the house is clean or not half the time because it could be the seller's in the process of moving out still. Then we have personal property. If the seller leaves anything behind, it becomes the property of the buyer immediately upon closing. So, or upon possession, I should say. So if there's something, say the seller leaves a lawnmower in the garage and the buyer 2 days later decides, yeah, we don't need the extra lawnmower. We're going to sell it. They throw it out there on offer up and get an offer for it. It goes away. And a week later, the seller knocks on the door and says, hey, we accidentally left the lawnmower in the garage. We would like to get the lawnmower back. Well, wow, we sold it. Well, then we want you to pay us the money for that. Well, no, the contract says here that any personal property remaining on the property after possession shall become the property of the buyer and may be retained or disposed of as the buyer determines. The next clause is utilities. This is basically saying, hey, seller, we think you're on a public water main. We think you're on a septic. We think that you have cable. We think you have internet, natural gas, etc. This is where the seller would confirm that. They would be required to counter this. Say if you put a sewer main, but it's actually on septic, and the seller agrees to that, then the seller has created a situation where your buyer could terminate because the seller has essentially misstated something in an egregious way. Insulation clause will hardly ever come up. If you're doing new construction, most builders already have their own insulation form. Leased property, if there is a lease to anything having to do with the property, your buyer has the right to review that lease, make sure that they want to deal with that, or they have the right to terminate if they don't. If there is an HOA, or if you think there's an HOA, and this isn't always just condos, then you will check this box for HOA. By the way, we didn't talk about legal descriptions. If the only way to know for sure if something is a condo is look at the legal description. If the word condominium is in the legal description, it's a condo. And then you're going to use Form 28, which is a condominium purchase and sale agreement. But homes that are not condos can also have HOAs. You want to be sure your buyer gets all of this information in this paragraph. They're entitled to it so that they can make a decision. Is this home going to suit their purposes in every possible way? Will they be able to live here in the way they thought they were going to be able to? If there's a transfer fee on the homeowners association, this is where you can check that box and ask the seller to pay for that. If the seller decides they want to keep something, say there's some drapes. The drapes were a wedding gift from somebody in the family or whatever, and they want to keep those drapes. They have to exclude it here because it says earlier in the contract that all window treatments stay with the house. So they would exclude it here. And then finally, if you're going to buy your client a home warranty, then this is where you can ask for that. You can give information about that. Or if the escrow company is treating you to a home warranty, that's where you can put that information in as well. Really quickly, because we are now officially over time, thank you for hanging in there. I'm going to get you out of here in just a minute or two. I want to go to the inspection. Number one, if you're waiving your inspection, it's a Form 35W. In this case, though, we're going to ask for an inspection. We're going to use Form 35. I want you to read it. It's fairly self-explanatory. Your buyer needs to hire the inspector. The inspector must be licensed, or the buyer can do their own inspection. The buyer has the right of having a sewer inspection, which is something especially on older properties with big trees and things like that. It's a good idea. It costs a little more, but it's a good idea because it's amazing how often sewers get clogged by roots. The buyer shall not make alterations to the property. The buyer will have to pay for any damage they do to the property. The buyer needs to pay for the inspection. The buyer needs to hire the inspector, not you, because we need that buyer to say, wait, nobody influenced this inspector. It was my hire, my decision. The buyer needs, it defaults at 10 days here to do the inspection and ask for anything they find wrong with the property. So they have choices on day 10. If we stayed at 10, they would have to send over a Form 35R saying that they approved the inspection and they're going forward, or they could say that they disapproved the inspection and they're terminating, or they can say they need to do some additional inspections. That's another box they can check. Additional inspection is say that the inspector turns on the faucets and none of the faucets are running. Well, the inspector isn't allowed to turn the water on or off. So he may recommend, hey, you need to have a plumber come out and check to make sure the water is working properly. That would be an automatic additional inspection. Or finally, you can propose repairs, or say that you want finances for the repairs to be done. Then you would itemize those. Here's the most important thing I'm going to tell you about this form, though. We're going to drop down a little bit, and that is right here. The buyer shall not provide the inspection report or portions of the report to the seller unless the seller requests otherwise in writing. They can request it right down here in writing in 4B, or they can do a Form 35C, which C stands for consent. But if they don't give you that, do not, under any circumstances, give a portion of the inspection report to the listing broker or the seller, because it means your client will have waived their inspection as soon as you deliver that. And then your buyer is going to be very mad at you for having sent that report over, because they don't know any better. So anyway, be really careful there. It does say, though, that this does not prohibit the buyer from the buyer's description of requested repairs or modifications or copies of contractor bids within Form 35R pursuant to paragraph 3 and 6 of this addendum. Okay, so when you do your 35R or some other addendum on 35R, you could say, please see attached Form 34. On 34, you could say, repair the roof. Well, that's basically you're telling the seller what's wrong with their house. That is not a violation where you're giving a portion of the report. Do not copy and paste language from the inspection report on that Form 35R. You don't need to explain things. You just need to ask for them. Then you can verbally explain them if need be later on. Okay, final thing that I want to bring up really fast. That form, again, I want you to get comfortable with it, read it. Skyline has a form we want you to use if you're working with a buyer, Skyline Legal Notice to Buyer. And this form covers seller disclosures. It gives a little more language about that, so you'll check this box because you're going to provide seller disclosures to your client, or if you don't, it tells them their rights thereof. If there's a septic system, we want you to use this form. If there's a resale certificate, that's normally going to be a condominium or a public offering statement. That's a brand new, never been lived in before condominium. We want your buyer to understand their rights under the resale cert and public offering statement laws, and let your buyers know what it is that they're entitled to. And then if there is HOA documents, we want your buyer to say they did receive them or they didn't. And if they didn't, we're hoping that later on you'll resubmit this form with something where it says that they did, because you're going to hound that other broker mercilessly to get those HOA docs. And then finally, if your buyer makes an offer that's over the purchase or over the list price, there's a risk there that they're going to be negative equity right out of the gate. We want them to understand that. So please have them fill in the appropriate blanks on this one. It's not all of them normally. Could be, but not normally. And then have them sign this document. There's actually going to be, scroll for me. There we go. But then your name is going to go in here as well. You don't have to sign, but you're going to fill in your name. Okay. So, okay. So that is everything that I'm going to cover today in the class.